Right, and so so thank you for all attending today's tech talk. I'm going to hand over to Mark Johnson, who's going to be talking about reactive interfaces in Moodle. Feel free to ask your questions in the chat. I will keep an eye on them, and I will let Mark know when anybody has a question. All right, Mark, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Right, here we go. So first of all, a bit about what we're talking about when we're talking about reactive interfaces. Reactive patterns are a way of writing JavaScript. In particular, it's a way of building a JavaScript interface from components, and those components respond to changes that are triggered throughout the page, or they react to changes, hence reactive. The components have a single shared state, which is a data model that is the single source of truth for the data that's used by the UI. As we'll see, you can actually have several of these reactive applications, which each have their own state in a single page in the web browser. But within your reactive application, there is one state, and everything is based on that state. User actions aren't allowed to trigger UI updates is the biggest difference between sort of good old JavaScript and reactive JavaScript. So when a user performs an action, all that is allowed to happen in response to that action is it updates the state. It's not allowed to update other components on the page. And then components observe the state for changes using events, which we'll see later, and then they can update themselves based on the change that was made to the state. So if we look at a non-reactive example of how we might write a bit of JavaScript to do something, I've got here a task list with checkboxes for each task, and at the bottom is a progress bar showing how many how many tasks completed, and there's also an indicator to show when the whole list is complete here. And the way that we might do this with traditional JavaScript is we have an event listener on that listens for clicks on the checkboxes. When a checkbox is clicked, we find out whether it's been checked or unchecked. We look at the whole list and we find how many have been checked, and then we find the other elements that we want to update, the progress bar and the completion indicator, and we call a function to update them based on the new state of the checkboxes. And we might update the style of the checkbox that was checked or unchecked, although in reality, we'd probably do that with CSS, not with JavaScript, but just as an additional example of how we might be updating the page in response to the user's actions. So if we step out and take a look at how a reactive version of this might be architected, then we'll go back and look at how it might be implemented. So this is a very simplified view of how the reactive stuff works. You have your reactive application, which in this case is our task list, and that has a number of components inside it, which might be each of the checkboxes and the progress bar and the completion indicator. As well as that, the reactive application is maintaining the state. When a user interacts with a component, it can send a mutation to the state saying, here's some data which I'd like to change. And when the state receives a change, it then fires an event to say what has been updated, and components can listen for those events and then do things in response to them. Doing something like this is not allowed. You can't have a component try and basically make changes directly to another component. It all has to go via the state. So looking at how we might do this task list with a more reactive pattern, here we still have a click event listener on the checklist. All that is doing is getting the new checked or unchecked state of the checkbox, and then it is calling the calling for an update on the state with the ID of the element that was clicked and the new checked state. This is sort of pseudocode. It's not really how it looks in Moodle. We'll see how it looks in Moodle in a bit. And then the progress bar has its own event listener, which is listening for a task having its checked property updated. And then in response to that, it sees whether it was checked or not and increases or decreases its count and then updates the display of the progress bar itself. So rather than the checkbox updating the progress bar updates the progress bar. And similarly for the completion indicator, that looks for the same event, a task having its checked property updated in the state. It then looks at the whole state and sees if there are any checkboxes which are still unchecked. And if not, then it sets itself to show it's complete. And if not, it sets itself to show it's incomplete. So again, it's the indicator that is updating itself rather than an event triggered by something else that's updating itself. How this all fits into Moodle. So since Moodle 4, there is a core reactive JavaScript module, and that provides a basic reactive framework. There are other JavaScript frameworks which are purely reactive, but this is just a bit which sits reasonably nicely within Moodle's existing templates and JavaScript and everything else. So we're not reinventing the wheel or bolting on a whole new JavaScript framework just to do this. There's some pretty good documentation on the developer docs site, which goes through the whole architecture in detail and how you do events and state mutations and so on. There's also code comments in the reactive classes, which explain how to use them in tandem with the documentation. The reason I'm talking about this at all is because it is basically now the blessed way to implement drag and drop interfaces in Moodle core. So that, as we'll see, I've been working on a drag and drop interface, and the reactive framework has a drag drop component, which you can essentially attach to any reactive component that you create to make it either a draggable item, a drop zone, or both. And then that handles all of the events that need to be tracked to do with dragging and dropping and passes data between the thing you're dragging and the thing you're dropping on. So it kind of takes care of all of that. So that's why I went ahead and learned all of this, because I needed to do drag and drop. I wouldn't necessarily choose it if I wasn't going down that path due to some intricacies we'll see later. But it works very well for this use case. In core, I think the only place it's currently used is on the course page, as we'll see at the minute, and that's the reason it was introduced into core. Right, so now we're going to look at how it actually fits in real life. So if I move that over there, right, you should now see my browser window. So this is a test course on probably the latest version of Moodle, but it's all basically the same since Moodle 4. So if I put this course page into editing mode, we can reorder any of the items in this course page by dragging and dropping them. We also have the same list of items in this table of contents on the left. And you'll notice that if I pick up small files here and I drop it into new section here, the same change is instantly reflected here. And the same the other way around. If I now drag small files back, then that's instantly reflected here as well. So what's happening there is you drag and drop one of these, it updates the state on the page, and then each of these lists is watching for those updates and will make the change in response to the change to the state, rather than you having to drop it here and then this says, okay, now I've moved here, and also go and look in this list and make the same change here. Each list is managing how it's displayed in response to the state. And yeah, because they wanted to have this parity between the two different lists is why we have the reactive framework in Moodle, basically. So now a bit more of a complicated example, which is what I'm actually working on, and we'll look a bit at the innards of how it works as well. So here I'm working on the, oh, sorry, kicked my microphone there. We're working on the interface for managing question categories in the question bank. And this is a bit more complex because it's a nested tree of categories. So any category may have parent categories. And at the moment, we also have different contexts which might contain question categories, which we want to be able to move stuff between. Now, the in terms of how the innards of it all works, the state management is a bit of a black box. You don't really get to see how all of that works. So to make it easier to debug, when they added the reactive module, they also added down the bottom of the page when you have debugging enabled, a little debug panel. So here we see a button for each of the reactive instances which are on this page. So I said earlier we could have multiple. So we still have the course editor here. We've got the process monitor, which I think is what we're actually looking at down here, and my reactive instance, which is the category manager. So if I click on this and open it up, we get some debugging tools. You can turn highlighting on, which will outline each component in your reactive instance. So here we can see each list is a component and each item is a component. I'm not sure what read mode on does. I won't touch that now in case it breaks something. We can see the current context. So here, within the context, we have a page object with a few bits of information. We have a list of categories. So this is the data that's tracking the basically the position of each of the categories in the list, which we'll see that update in a minute. And we also have a list of the category lists. So each list and sublist has an entry here, which is basically tracking how many children it has. And then below that, we have state events log. So if we were to change the order by dragging and dropping here, we then see a whole load of things output here, which is representing an update to the state. And each of these is the name of an event. So where I showed before, we were listening to things like task, checked, updated. That's where I got that from. So here we see the events that have been fired and the order they've been fired in. So it starts, state updates are transactional. So it's a sort of all or nothing thing. So you'll always get a transaction start event. And then we get a categories.id updated. So that means that a category has had its ID updated. We then get the category with its ID number that had its ID updated. We then get that the category was updated, had some fields updated. Then we get some categories are updated. And then we get that the state was updated. So at any point, we can listen to the specific event or a more general event and then make some changes in response to that. And you can see we have, for each change that was made, we have a state update. The ones that we're particularly interested in this case is where the sort order is updated. I think that's all that we're actually seeing here because we've just moved within a category. The other thing that we can do is move between parents. So if I was to grab this one and move it inside subcategory here, we'll see that this transaction here, as well as updating the sort order, we should see an update to a parent property somewhere there, parent updated. And also the old and new parent had their child count updated. The reason for that is that when a category doesn't have any children yet, we can drop a category into it, and then it creates a new child list. And those are all reactive components. So the drop target to create a new child is a reactive component, and then the new list is also a reactive component. And when you drag something out so that it is when you drag something into a category so it's no longer so it now has children, then that drop target gets removed. So you can see there's not one there anymore, but there is one down here. Right. So that's how I've built an interface that uses reactive components, and we've seen a bit about the events that happen along the way. I'll now dig a little bit into the code, not too much, because there's a lot more going on than I've just shown, and it gets quite complicated. But if we just start off with category manager, which is the actual reactive instance. So basically here we're creating a new category manager reactive object. So we're defining that class here, extends reactive, and then we create an instance of it and export that as essentially a global object from this JavaScript module. So anywhere that we include this JavaScript module, we will have this instance of the reactive object, and we're basically providing it with some metadata, which isn't terribly important in the way that I've used it here. When we initialize this, we load the initial state. You might do this in a number of ways, such as calling a web service. In this case, I'm just looking at the lists that are on the page and pulling the data out to form that initial state. There's also a method here called set cat order, which I've attached to this object just because we call it from several places throughout the application. We'll see how that's used in a minute. Right, if we now look at a component within the reactive instance. So here we've got a moustache template, which represents a list item. And this list item is one of these category items here. And it's got a whole load of data attributes attached to it, just tracking basically the bits of data that are stored in the state. And at the bottom of the template, we are calling a JavaScript module and passing in the ID of this list item. And this JavaScript module is a reactive component. So if we go into the file that defines this module, we have a class that extends base components. So all reactive components extend the base component class. If we go to the init function, it's returning a new instance of this class. And that is what registers a new component with the reactive instance. So it will have an element, which is the root element from the template. And that is essentially how the reactive component is represented on the page. Selectors I've not used yet, and then reactive is the reactive instance. So category manager here, that is the same object that we created here. So we're at the top where we've got our imports, we're importing category manager from the category manager module, and that is our instance of the reactive object. So some things that this component does to make it drag and droppable. Here, state ready is what's fired basically once the component is ready and the state has initialized. We are calling init drag drop, which defines a method called get draggable data, and then it creates a new drag drop component and passes in this object. So when you create a new drag drop component, you pass in an existing reactive component. Then that looks to see if it has a get draggable data method defined. If it is, then you can drag it. If it doesn't, you can't drag it. The other thing it looks for is does it have a method called validate drop data? If it does, it's a drop target. If not, it's not a drop target. And then you have some other events that you can define. The one that we care about is drop. So this is what gets called if you drop another component onto this component. And essentially what we're doing here is looking at what it's been dropped onto, which list it's in, and working out what the new position in that list needs to be. What we're not doing is actually moving it to the new position, because we're not allowed to do that here. What we do instead is we call that set cat order function, which we saw earlier. And what that is doing is calling a web service, which will save the new position in the database. So that means that if we were then to refresh the page, even if the rest of the JavaScript failed, we would then see the new order. But what we do with the response to that is we pass it to the state manager. There's a function called process updates, which is basically a way, an easy way of taking a list of updates and making them all in one go. There are other ways of updating the state manually, but I found this is the easiest way to do it. And in fact, we should look at what that web service returns. So here is the return definition for the web service. It's returning a list of objects with a name, an action, and a fields property. So the name is the object, the type of object within the state you're updating. The action is the kind of update you're doing. That can be various sorts of HTTP verb sounding things like put, post, delete, and so on. I have always used put so far, which is basically create or update the object within the state. And then fields, you can return the fields that you need to update. You need to have an ID so it knows which one it's updating, and then all of the others in this case are optional. But basically any web service can return a structure like this, and then in the JavaScript you can pass it to state manager.processUpdates, and it will handle updating the state and firing the events inside the sort of black box of the state manager. What happens next is that the category component is listening for some events. We won't worry about these template context ones, but we are listening for categories, and then this category ID is updated. So in this case, each component is listening for any update to its own state. Another approach here might be that you could have multiple event listeners for the different properties. So we saw that the sort order might be updated, the parent might be updated, yeah, there's some other bits, the context or the drag handle might be updated as well. However, because of the way that my particular case works, you might want to be changing both of them at the same time. It might be moving to a new parent and have a new sort order within that parent. So what you don't want to do is update the sort order where it currently is and then move it to a new parent. Because the updates are always processed in order, we can't say listen for the parent being updated. Oh, but if the sort order is being updated as well, wait for that first. They happen in the order and they are processed in that order. So in this case, we have to say listen for any update, which is always fired after the individual updates. And then we call this update position method as a result, and that goes through all of the properties, works out what's been changed, works out what we need to do as a result, and then somewhere here it is actually, here we go, moving the element to its new position. The other thing that then happens is this might trigger its own state updates. So if we've moved between parents, it then triggers additional updates to the category lists in the states to basically indicate how many children each list now has. And this is exactly the same structure that we see over here, just in JavaScript. So the name is category lists, the action is put, and then we have the list of fields, which is the ID of the category we're updating, and the child count. We then have another component for the category lists, which is listening for this update here. So we're listening for category lists, child count updated. And in that case, we're looking to see whether we need to add that drop target we saw earlier to add a new child, or whether the list is now empty and needs to be removed entirely. So that's quite a lot of information. As I said, there's a lot more here which I've completely glossed over because I didn't want to go too in depth into this, and a lot of this is still work in progress. A problem that I've encountered, which I'm not quite sure the best way of resolving yet with something like this. So each of these can be edited, and it has a pop-up edit form here. When I edit this, I save changes and it fires off a web service request to save the changes to the database. What I then need to do is re-render this item from its template. However, as I mentioned earlier, the reactive component is linked to the element on the page. So if you were to just re-render it, then things get messed up with, if you were just to replace it wholesale, then things get messed up with the event handlers. And because of the way I've currently got the template structured, if I was to re-render it with the same template, I would then actually end up creating a whole new reactive component with the new data. And I need to really throw away the old one, but I'm not sure if, I'm not sure if the component which is displaying and handling this form should be throwing away another component, or how that's meant to be handled at the moment. So I've still got some learning to do, still got some teething issues to do. The drag and drop works very well, but yeah, the other stuff is a bit more complicated, as I'm finding out. So in summary, Core Reactive provides a module for reactive UIs in Moodle. Reactive components can't interact with each other directly. They can only update the state and react to state updates. They're useful if you have multiple components reacting to changes in the data, in the state data. They are also the blessed way to do drag and drop. So if you want to do a drag and drop interface, this is the sort of supported way within Moodle to do it. And the fly in the ointment is that things can get fiddly when you want to do things like dynamically updating displayed components. If you want to read more, I highly recommend going through the guide in the developer documentation. There is also an example plugin called Mod Nosferatu, which actually has some real JavaScript that you can run and poke around at, which is implementing a reactive interface. Which is, I cribbed quite heavily from that to begin with, just to work out how all the plumbing of the components worked. And right, that's me done.